Have you ever watched people fight over pennies while a fortune quietly grows without them? I have. At the time, I didn't know the exact number. I only knew it was getting bigger. Every day they argued, every letter they sent, every meeting they delayed, the number grew. Compounding patiently. Silently. Without drama. By the time they realized what they'd been fighting over, my lost $400,000 had become $670,000. And that was just the interest. The argument started in a lawyer's office that smelled faintly of dust and burnt coffee. My siblings sat across from me at a long conference table, papers spread out like territory markers. Everyone talked at once, voices layered with irritation and entitlement. Words like fair share, technicality, and oversight floated through the air, each one heavier than the last. I said nothing. I had learned long ago that silence unsettles people who expect agreement. They were arguing over expense reimbursements. Over who paid for what during Mom's final years. Over whether certain withdrawals were authorized. It was exhausting. Small numbers. Short memories. Emotional math. No one mentioned the bond. Not because it wasn't important, but because they thought it was gone. The bond had been issued decades earlier, back when people still trusted paper certificates and handwritten ledgers. It was supposed to mature years ago. Supposed to be redeemed. Supposed to be accounted for. Instead, it vanished. Or so everyone assumed. When Mom died, the bond became a footnote, a line item dismissed as lost, unrecoverable, not worth pursuing. My siblings accepted that explanation eagerly. It simplified things. Reduced the estate. Made the remaining assets easier to divide. I didn't accept it. I just didn't argue. Because arguing requires certainty, and at the time, I had something better, suspicion. While they debated whether $50 here or $100 there should be reimbursed, I sat quietly, watching their hands tremble with frustration. I thought about the way Mom used to organize her papers. The way she labeled envelopes. The way she never threw anything away without a reason. A woman like that doesn't simply lose $400,000. She hides it. I didn't say that out loud. I nodded when they spoke. I took notes when the lawyer explained timelines. I agreed when they said chasing the bond would cost more than it was worth. They mistook my calm for concession. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd already begun looking. Quietly. Methodically. Without permission. While they argued over pennies, I was following interest statements. While they accused each other of greed, I was learning how compounded instruments behave when left untouched for years. While they fought to close the estate quickly, I was letting time do what it does best. Grow value for those patient enough to wait. I didn't need to win the argument. I needed to let it continue. Because every day they delayed resolution, every month the bond remained unclaimed, the number climbed higher, protected by bureaucracy, shielded by their own assumptions. By the time the truth surfaced, the argument no longer mattered. The pennies didn't matter. What mattered was that the bond they dismissed as lost had been doing exactly what it was designed to do. Accumulate. And I was the only one who knew where to find it. I was 61 when my mother died, old enough to understand that money doesn't reveal who people are, it confirms it. I've never been the loud one in my family. Not the decisive one either, at least not in ways that show up in meeting minutes. I learned early that speaking last often means speaking with leverage. So I listened. I watched. I remembered. My siblings used to tease me for that. Said I took too many notes. Asked too many unnecessary questions. Accused me of overthinking things that didn't matter anymore. I smiled when they said it. Smiles cost nothing, and they disarm people who want reassurance more than truth. I built my life quietly. A long career that rewarded consistency, not bravado. A marriage that lasted because neither of us tried to win every argument. Savings accumulated the slow way. Automatic transfers, conservative instruments, patience instead of panic. I wasn't wealthy, but I was solvent. And more importantly, I understood time. My mother did too. She came from a generation that distrusted spectacle. She believed wealth should be boring, invisible, and resilient. She clipped coupons long after she didn't need to. She kept meticulous records, filed alphabetically and chronologically, because disorder offended her sense of dignity. When she invested once and forgot about it, not out of neglect, but confidence. She believed good decisions didn't need constant supervision. That bond was one of those decisions. I remembered it because I'd been with her the day she bought it. I was in my 20s, standing in a bank lobby that smelled like paper and furniture polish. She signed the paperwork with deliberate strokes and told me, almost casually, that this was for later. Later when? I asked. She smiled. When I don't need to explain myself anymore. That stuck with me. Years passed. The bond faded into background memory. Life moved forward. Careers, illnesses, responsibilities layered over each other until later became a vague horizon. Then she died. Estate meetings bring out strange behavior in people. Familiar faces sharpen. Voices harden. Grief doesn't unite. It competes. Everyone wants their version of fairness validated. My siblings approached the process like a race. Close accounts. Liquidate. Divide. Finish. Speed felt like control to them. I didn't rush. Because rushing means you trust that everything visible is everything that exists. When the bond came up, it was dismissed quickly. Lost certificate. No recent statements. Too old to trace. The lawyer used words like unlikely and impractical. My siblings latched onto that immediately. Relief masked as pragmatism. I asked a single question. When was the last time anyone tried? No one answered directly. That was my answer. I knew my mother's habits. She didn't lose things. She repositioned them. She didn't leave money exposed. She insulated it from panic, from family pressure, from impulsive decisions made under emotional stress. She would never have trusted a noisy ending. I didn't challenge the group. I let the conclusions stand. Let the bond be labeled lost. Let it reduce the estate on paper. Let expectations adjust downward. That was important. People reveal their truest selves when they believe the stakes are low. As the meetings dragged on, I watched my siblings argue over minor reimbursements. Who paid which bill? Who deserved compensation for caregiving? The amounts were small, but the emotions were enormous. I stayed out of it. Because while they were busy measuring fairness in tens and hundreds, I was thinking in decades. At night, I went through my own memories. The way my mother labeled folders. The institutions she trusted. The phrases she used when she wanted something to stay untouched. I didn't need the certificate. I needed the trail. And trails don't reveal themselves to people in a hurry. By the time the estate attorney suggested we move on from the bond issue entirely, I was already certain of one thing. The bond wasn't lost. It was waiting. And patience, real patience, always earns interest. Families don't fracture over large sums the way people imagine. They fracture over details. The estate meetings became routine quickly. Too quickly. Same conference room. Same tired pastries no one touched. Same arguments that started small and swelled with emotion. My siblings treated every session like a battlefield, arriving armed with receipts, grievances, and carefully rehearsed indignation. They spoke in absolutes. Always. Never. Everyone knows. I spoke rarely. It wasn't fear that kept me quiet. It was assessment. I'd learned long ago that when people argue loudly about money, they aren't really arguing about numbers. They're arguing about recognition. About who mattered more. Who sacrificed more. Who deserved acknowledgement now that the person who once balanced those scales was gone. My mother had been the glue. The quiet arbiter. The one who smoothed edges without anyone noticing. Without her, Every unresolved tension floated to the surface, demanding attention. My siblings framed their urgency as responsibility. Bills needed paying. Accounts needed closing. The estate needed closure. Closure, I noticed, was always something they wanted quickly, before doubt could creep in. They didn't like unanswered questions. I did. Because unanswered questions leave room for leverage. The bond came up one final time during a particularly heated meeting. Someone mentioned it in passing, almost irritably, like an annoyance that refused to disappear. "It's gone," one of them said. "We've been over this." The lawyer nodded, relieved to move on. I nodded too. Not agreement. Alignment. Letting something be dismissed is often the safest way to keep it intact. From that point on, the dynamic shifted. With the bond written off, the remaining assets felt smaller, scarcer. Every dollar became contested. Every decision felt personal. They argued over storage fees, appraisal costs, even sentimental items with negligible value. Pennies. Actual pennies. I watched grown adults raise their voices over amounts that would barely register in a monthly budget, because the argument wasn't about money anymore. It was about control. And control makes people sloppy. They stopped double-checking. Stopped asking broader questions. They wanted resolution, not understanding. Speed, not certainty. Meanwhile, I stayed home and started working. Not dramatically. Not obsessively. Methodically. I pulled old bank names from memory. Institutions my mother trusted because they'd existed longer than her doubts. I searched merger histories, name changes, acquisitions, the quiet evolution of financial entities over decades. Money doesn't disappear. It migrates. The bond was issued by a firm that no longer existed under its original name. That was the first obstacle. The second was time. Instruments like that age quietly, gathering value while paperwork thins and people forget. Perfect conditions for invisibility. I followed the trail carefully. No phone calls yet. No formal inquiries. Just research. Pattern recognition. Cross-referencing issue dates with institutional histories. Every night, while my siblings drafted emails accusing each other of selfishness, I studied how compounded interest behaves when untouched for long periods. The math was astonishing. $400,000 doesn't just sit still. It works. It compounds. It grows impatient with neglect. By my rough estimates, even conservative assumptions placed the bond's current value far beyond what my siblings imagined the entire estate was worth. And the longer it stayed unclaimed, the more undeniable that gap became. That's when I realized something else. The bond wasn't just hidden. It was protected by their disbelief. They believed it was gone, so they stopped looking, stopped asking, stopped imagining it could still matter. Belief is a powerful barrier. The estate process dragged on. Tensions escalated. One sibling accused another of manipulating the lawyer. Another threatened mediation. The lawyer sighed more often. I remained calm. Because while they were busy fighting to divide what they could see, something invisible was quietly tipping the balance of the entire story. The bond was accruing interest. So was my advantage. And by the time they realized the argument they'd been having didn't matter anymore, the number would be too large to ignore, and too well documented to dispute. They thought the estate was shrinking. They had no idea it was growing. Without them. Betrayal doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes it comes from convenience. The moment my siblings agreed the bond was lost, something subtle but irreversible happened. They didn't just dismiss an asset, they dismissed my memory, my experience, my understanding of our mother. And they did it easily, because it made everything else simpler. What hurt wasn't the decision itself. It was how quickly they made it without me. They spoke about the bond as if it had never really existed. As if my recollection was sentimental, unreliable, or irrelevant. One sibling laughed lightly and said, "If it was real, we'd have paperwork." Another shrugged and added, "Mom probably cashed it years ago and forgot." Forgot. That word stung more than I expected. My mother didn't forget financial instruments. She didn't forget anything she considered important. The suggestion wasn't just incorrect, it was dismissive. It rewrote her competence to justify their impatience. I corrected them once. Gently. I reminded them I'd been there when she bought it. That I remembered the issuing bank. That instruments like that didn't simply vanish. They didn't argue back. They smiled politely and moved on. That was the betrayal. Not a shouted disagreement. Not exclusion from a decision. But the quiet consensus that my knowledge didn't matter enough to slow the process. From that point forward, I stopped offering reminders. Instead, I watched how the assumption spread. The lawyer adjusted projections downward. The estate's working value shrank. My siblings' expectations recalibrated. They began spending their future shares in their minds, planning how quickly things would be resolved once the final numbers were locked. The bond's absence became a convenience everyone benefited from, except me. Because I knew better. And knowing something others choose not to believe is a lonely place to stand. I realized then that if I pushed harder, demanded searches, filed objections, delayed proceedings, they'd resent me. Accuse me of dragging things out. Of clinging to false hope. Of complicating an already painful process. Worse, they'd start paying attention. Attention would bring scrutiny. Scrutiny would bring interference. And interference could cost me far more than patience ever would. So I let the betrayal sit quietly between us. I let them believe the bond was gone. I let them divide the estate as if it were smaller than it truly was. I let the narrative form without me correcting it. Because betrayal cuts both ways. And when people underestimate you, they create the conditions for their own correction. Behind the scenes, my investigation deepened. I found the bond's CUSIP number buried in an old tax summary my mother had kept. It wasn't labeled clearly, just a line item with a cryptic abbreviation and a value that hadn't been updated in decades. That was all I needed. CUSIP numbers don't lie. They survive mergers, acquisitions, rebrandings. They're fingerprints in a system built to remember even when people don't. Following that trail confirmed my suspicions. The issuing firm had been absorbed twice, restructured once, and now existed as a subsidiary of a major financial institution. One my siblings assumed had no connection to our family. The bond hadn't disappeared. It had matured, rolled over, and continued accruing interest under custodial management. Exactly the kind of instrument my mother favored. The loss was administrative, not financial. But I didn't contact the institution yet. Because timing matters. If I surfaced the bond too early, it would be pulled into the estate's chaos. Lawyers would get involved. Shares would be recalculated. The interest would be divided. That wasn't what my mother intended. She bought that bond quietly. She held it patiently. And I suspected she did so knowing exactly how her children would behave once she was gone. Some people prepare for death by writing wills. Others prepare by creating distance between money and conflict. The betrayal wasn't that my siblings ignored me. It was that they proved, without meaning to, why my mother structured things the way she did. And as the estate arguments grew louder and smaller all at once, I made a decision. I wouldn't fight them over pennies. I'd let time finish the work they'd started, and let the interest keep compounding while they argued themselves into irrelevance. Once you decide not to confront people, you gain an unexpected advantage. They stop performing. My siblings assumed the estate was entering its final phase. Meetings shortened. Emails lost urgency. The arguments remained, but they grew repetitive, looping over the same small grievances like a needle stuck in a worn groove. They were tired of the process and eager to be done. I used that fatigue. I began the investigation the way my mother would have. Quietly, without alerts, without emotion. No phone calls that would create records. No formal requests that would trigger notifications. Just research, cross-checking, and patience. The CUSIP number was my compass. With that, I traced the bond's lineage through decades of institutional evolution. Banks merged. Trust companies rebranded. Custodial services were folded into investment divisions with different names and different phone trees. To most people, that kind of trail looks like a dead end. To me, it looked like a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Protect long-term value from short-term interference. I requested archived prospectuses under the guise of academic research. I read old SEC filings, annual reports, and custodial agreements written in language that assumed no one would ever bother to read them carefully again. Buried in those documents were answers. The bond wasn't a simple instrument. It had been structured to roll automatically at maturity, converting into a successor bond unless explicitly redeemed. No notice required. No action necessary. Interest compounded quietly, custodially, indefinitely. My mother had chosen that structure deliberately. She hadn't wanted reminders. She hadn't wanted temptation. And she certainly hadn't wanted family debate. At night, I ran calculations. Conservative ones. Even with modest rates, decades of compounding turned 400,000 into something far more significant. The longer I calculated, the harder it became to keep my breathing steady. By my estimates, the principal alone had grown well beyond what my siblings thought the entire estate was worth. And then there was the interest. Interest that hadn't stopped. Interest that didn't care about arguments, meetings, or emotional exhaustion. Interest that rewarded only one thing: time. When I finally felt certain, not hopeful, not speculative, but certain, I made my first call. I contacted the institution now holding custodial responsibility for legacy instruments tied to that CUSIP. I didn't mention my family. I didn't mention an estate. I asked only whether instruments issued under that number were still being serviced. The answer came back after a brief hold. Yes. That single word felt heavier than any accusation I could have made in those estate meetings. From there, the process became more formal. Identity verification. Proof of relationship. Death certificate. All things my siblings assumed would be obstacles. They weren't. Institutions don't care about family dynamics. They care about documentation. And I had it. Weeks passed. During that time, my siblings continued their slow-motion dispute over small sums. They debated whether to split minor tax refunds evenly or proportionally. They revisited old caregiving expenses like accountants arguing over rounding errors. They didn't ask what I was doing. They assumed I'd given up. Then the statement arrived. It came in a plain envelope, unremarkable, almost apologetic in its simplicity. Inside was a single-page summary of holdings tied to the bond's successor instruments. I read it once. Then again. The principal had grown far beyond its original value. But what stopped me wasn't the total. It was the interest line. $670,000. Accrued. Untouched. Generated quietly while my siblings fought over pennies and postage stamps. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that, statement folded neatly in front of me. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I felt validated. Not because I'd won, but because my mother's logic had held. Her faith in time, structure, and silence had paid off exactly as she intended. The bond hadn't been lost. It had been growing. And now I faced a choice that would determine how the rest of the story unfolded. I could surface it immediately, collapse the estate process into chaos and renegotiation. Or I could wait just a little longer. Because interest doesn't just accumulate on money. It accumulates on leverage. And I wasn't done letting time do its work. There's a difference between patience and avoidance. I crossed that line the day the statement arrived. Up until then, waiting had been strategic, a way to gather facts, preserve value, and stay invisible while others exhausted themselves. But once I saw the number in ink, once the interest line stared back at me with undeniable authority, Waiting became something else entirely. It became a choice. I slept poorly that night, not from excitement, but from responsibility. Money has weight, especially when it arrives quietly and disproves everyone else in the room. I understood now why my mother had structured the bond the way she did. Why she hadn't mentioned it again. Why she trusted time more than people. She hadn't wanted a fight. She'd wanted inevitability. The next estate meeting was scheduled for the following week. My siblings were eager to close. The lawyer had circulated a draft final accounting, neatly tying off loose ends, shrinking our shared history into a handful of tidy numbers. The bond wasn't listed. Of course it wasn't. On paper, the estate was nearly resolved. Emotionally, it was exhausted. Everyone wanted relief. Finality. An end to the low-grade hostility that had seeped into every interaction. That was the moment I chose. I didn't announce the bond. I didn't correct the accounting. I didn't interrupt the process. Instead, I asked one question. What happens if an asset surfaces after closure? The lawyer answered automatically. There were procedures. Amendments. Reopenings. It would be inconvenient. Potentially contentious. My siblings groaned. One rolled their eyes. Let's not borrow trouble, someone said. I nodded. Of course, I replied. But inside, the decision crystallized. I wouldn't introduce the bond into the estate at all. Not because I was hiding it, but because it was never meant to be part of their argument. The bond wasn't communal in spirit, even if it was technically inherited. My mother hadn't designed it for negotiation. She'd designed it for insulation. And now I understood the final piece. If I forced the bond into the estate process, it would be divided according to rules written for visibility, not intention. Lawyers would reduce it to fractions. Emotions would distort it. And the very thing my mother had protected would become another source of noise. I wasn't willing to do that. So I did something far simpler. I finalized the estate as presented. I signed. I accepted my share of the visible assets without objection. I let my siblings walk away believing the story was over. Relief washed over them immediately. Their voices softened. Plans resumed. Tension drained from conversations like air escaping a sealed room. They thought we'd reached closure. What we'd reached was separation. After the estate closed, I contacted the institution again, this time formally. I provided documentation establishing my status as beneficiary and executor of my mother's financial instructions related to the bond's successor instruments. There was no resistance. No suspicion. No drama. They'd been waiting too. The bond was re-registered. Access granted. Options presented. Everything unfolded with the calm efficiency of a system designed to honor time over noise. And still, I waited. I let the interest accrue through another cycle. Let statements update. Let the numbers become unassailable. Because when you finally speak, it should be with certainty so complete that no one can argue without exposing their own ignorance. My siblings found out indirectly. One of them mentioned casually that they'd been contacted by a financial advisor asking about legacy instruments. Another joked that maybe Mom had hidden money under a mattress after all. I smiled. Didn't correct them. Didn't confirm. Silence, when used deliberately, isn't deceit. It's restraint. The turning point wasn't when I discovered the bond. It was when I decided not to use it as a weapon. I would let the truth surface the way my mother intended, through structure, documentation, and time. No accusations. No shouting. Just facts arriving too late to be contested. Because the most powerful moment in any conflict isn't when you raise your voice. It's when you no longer need to. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It happened in pieces. Small, delayed realizations that arrived too late to be rearranged. The first crack appeared a month after the estate closed. One of my siblings called me, voice casual but strained, asking if I'd received anything unusual in the mail. I asked what they meant. They hesitated, then mentioned a letter from a financial institution they didn't recognize, asking follow-up questions about our mother's accounts. They laughed it off. Probably nothing, they said. Just old paperwork catching up. I agreed. It was nothing, to them. To me, it was confirmation that the system had begun correcting the record on its own. When large sums move quietly, they create ripples. Compliance departments double-check. Legacy instruments trigger audits. Custodial files are reconciled. None of it is urgent. All of it is inevitable. My siblings had mistaken finality for control. What they didn't understand was that closure in a family does not stop processes outside it. The second crack came when the lawyer called. Not an emergency. Not an accusation. Just a question. Careful, professional. Were you aware of any assets that might not have been included in the final accounting? I answered honestly. Yes. Silence. Then cautiously, he asked why I hadn't disclosed them earlier. I didn't justify myself. I didn't explain my siblings' behavior or my mother's intentions. I stated a single fact. The instrument wasn't part of the estate's active holdings at the time of accounting. Which was true. The bond had matured, rolled, and continued under custodial management independent of the estate's visibility. Legally clean. Procedurally boring. Emotionally devastating, but only for those who assumed otherwise. The lawyer exhaled slowly. He didn't argue. He didn't accuse. He asked for documentation. I provided it. That was the moment the argument they'd been having for months officially became irrelevant. Because no amount of shouting over past reimbursements could compete with verified statements showing decades of compounded interest. Interest that had grown larger than the entire sum they'd fought over. My siblings found out the truth one by one. Not from me. From institutions. From advisors. From questions they weren't prepared to answer. And the reaction was exactly what I'd expected. Shock first. Then anger. Then recalculation. One accused me of hiding assets. Another suggested I'd manipulated the process. A third tried to argue intent, that Mom would have wanted everything shared equally. I didn't engage. I sent one email. Short. Factual. Attached statements. Custodial explanations. Dates. Numbers. No commentary. No emotion. Facts don't argue back. The accusations stopped almost immediately. Because once the numbers were visible, the story rewrote itself. They could no longer claim ignorance, not convincingly. They could no longer frame me as opportunistic when the timeline showed patience measured in decades, not weeks. They could no longer pretend this was an oversight when the structure proved deliberate. What they were left with was the uncomfortable truth. While they'd been fighting over pennies, my mother's largest asset had been quietly compounding, untouched by their urgency, protected from their impatience. The consequence wasn't that they lost money. It was that they lost certainty. They realized the estate they thought they controlled had never been complete. That their arguments had been about scraps. That their confidence had been misplaced. And perhaps most painful of all, that my silence hadn't been weakness. It had been distance. One sibling asked if I planned to do the right thing and redistribute the bond. I answered honestly. I already did. The right thing, in this case, wasn't redistribution. It was preservation. My mother hadn't trusted speed. She hadn't trusted consensus. She'd trusted structure, and she'd trusted the one person who wouldn't try to turn patience into performance. The bond didn't punish my siblings. It revealed them. And revelation, unlike revenge, doesn't fade. It stays. It sits with you. It forces you to reconsider every argument you thought mattered, and whether you were ever arguing about the right thing at all. After the truth surfaced, everything slowed down. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because there was nothing left to argue. The numbers spoke with a clarity no family meeting ever had. Statements replaced speculation. Dates replaced accusations. The estate that once felt crowded with voices became strangely silent. That silence wasn't hostile. It was reflective. My siblings didn't apologize right away. I didn't expect them to. People need time to reframe a story when they realize they've been telling it wrong. Especially when the mistake exposes impatience instead of malice. Weeks passed. Then months. The bond was formally separated from the estate in documentation, not contentiously, but cleanly. The lawyer confirmed what the institutions already knew, that the asset had never truly been part of the pool my siblings had been fighting over. There was no lawsuit. No dramatic showdown. Just a recalibration. One sibling asked if I felt guilty. The question surprised me. Guilt implies wrongdoing. And I hadn't done anything except listen, wait, and follow the structure my mother put in place long before anyone imagined needing it. I feel responsible, I answered. That was the truth. Responsibility feels heavier than guilt, but it sits better over time. I used the money carefully. Not extravagantly. Not performatively. I paid off debts that had no business lingering into my 60s. I created a buffer that allowed me to breathe differently. To plan without fear. To say no when necessary. I also honored my mother in ways that would have embarrassed her if she were alive. Quietly, anonymously, without plaques or recognition. Scholarships funded under neutral names. Contributions to programs that valued patience, education, and long-term thinking. Nothing flashy. Nothing loud. The siblings noticed, though. Not the amounts, but the absence of resentment. They expected bitterness. They expected distance. Instead, I stayed present. When family gatherings resumed, the tone was different. More careful. Less certain. People listened more than they spoke. Old patterns didn't vanish, but they softened. One sibling admitted something during a late conversation, voice low and unguarded. We were so busy trying to finish that we didn't think about what we were rushing past. That admission mattered. Not because it excused anything, but because it acknowledged the lesson my mother had engineered all along. Time rewards restraint. Money exposes impatience. And silence, when chosen deliberately, can be the most ethical response of all. I visited my mother's grave one afternoon and told her what had happened. Not in detail, but in essence. I thanked her for trusting structure more than emotion, and for trusting me enough to let the system work. Standing there, I realized the story wasn't about a bond. It was about tempo. She moved slowly on purpose. And by doing so, she protected what mattered from those who confuse urgency with importance. The aftermath wasn't victory. It was balance. And for the first time since her death, the family dynamic felt less like a competition and more like a shared understanding. Fragile, imperfect, but honest. The money had done what money does best when left alone. It waited. And in waiting, it taught everyone involved exactly what they needed to learn. The most important lesson in this story isn't about money. It's about impatience. People think wealth is created by bold moves, quick decisions, aggressive arguments, forceful conclusions. But real wealth, the kind that lasts and doesn't rot relationships from the inside, is built quietly. It grows when no one is watching. It rewards restraint, not volume. My siblings weren't bad people. They weren't greedy in the cartoonish sense. They were simply loud where silence would have served them better. Urgent where patience would have paid more. Certain where curiosity might have protected them. They argued over pennies because pennies were visible. They never considered what happens when something valuable is designed not to demand attention. My mother understood that. She understood that family dynamics change under pressure. That grief makes people short-sighted. That fairness becomes a weapon when people are afraid of being left out. She didn't try to manage those emotions after she was gone. She stepped around them entirely. That bond wasn't just an investment. It was insulation. A way of separating long-term value from short-term chaos. A way of letting time, not temperament, decide the outcome. And time did exactly what it always does. It compounded. While voices rose, numbers climbed. While meetings dragged on, interest accumulated. While assumptions hardened, value softened into certainty. No one interfered because no one believed it mattered. That's the paradox of patience. What you don't fight over often becomes the most powerful thing in the room. When the truth finally surfaced, it didn't need defense. It didn't need persuasion. It didn't need my voice at all. The numbers stood on their own, indifferent to who felt wronged or surprised. That's when I realized something else. Ethical justice doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like alignment. Nothing was taken. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was manipulated. The system my mother put in place simply ran its course, uninterrupted by noise. I didn't win because I outsmarted anyone. I won because I didn't interrupt time while others tried to control it. The moral is simple, but most people learn it too late. Don't rush to close what you don't fully understand. Don't assume silence means absence. And never underestimate what patience can build while others argue over scraps. Money grows when left alone. So does truth. And when both are allowed enough time, they arrive together. Quietly, undeniably, and beyond dispute. That was my inheritance. Not just the bond, but the wisdom to let it work.